Welcome. This is Feminism and Gender Issues lecture. I think that, well, again, I don't think that anyone actually knows what any of my lectures are about. Who thinks that this is about, like, feminist authors, and who thinks that this is about gender issues and debate? Oh, I guess. Who thinks the first?
Yeah.
Who thinks the second? Okay, we can do both, if you would like that. Would people like to do both?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to start out with the slides I prepared for you, which I think will also help facilitate discussion. So this is a brief history of feminism. When people talk about like feminist critiques that they're reading around, they usually talk about it as a second wave or a third wave critique. So just kind of to get a good idea of where we stand. So first wave feminism was the 19th and 20th centuries, and it was focused on overturning legal inequalities. So the term first wave feminism actually wasn't coined until the 1970s, but this has kind of been a term that has been created after the movements happened to describe what they did. So they focused on, and I can't pronounce this, de jure, or officially mandated instances of sexism. They focused on doing things like women's suffrage and overturning legal barriers that women faced in society. The next wave of feminism is second wave feminism, as is logical. It was the 1960s to the 1980s, and it focused on the role, it kind of went beyond just legal issues. It focused on the role of women in society. A bunch of things that you read talk about how this is where it expanded to become culturally relevant and embrace multiple types of people. There's some debate on where that happened, whether it happened in second wave or third wave feminism, because there have been a lot of critiques of second wave feminism for this. But it focused on the role of women in society, and focusing on fixing de facto, which I'm pretty sure I pronounced that one right, or unofficial instances of sexism and of women's rights abuses. Third wave of feminism is called the third wave of feminism. The 1990s to the 2000s, and I would say that we're kind of still in this. There are some authors that I would characterize as between the waves, some that I would characterize as post-waves. It's very rhizomatic. But it's a continuation of second wave, which that says third, but it should be second, and a response to its failures. So in a lot of ways, third wave feminism has incorporated postmodern feminism, which we'll talk about in a minute, but understanding ideas, two main ideas, I think, and someone who does women's and gender studies, correct me if I'm wrong. But the first one is that there isn't a universal woman. We can't say that we speak for a woman and attempt to speak for all women. We have different backgrounds, different cultural histories, different races, different sexualities, different economic statuses. And so third wave feminism attempts to grapple with the fact that in first and second wave feminism, a lot of people were excluded from these movements. And then the second thing that I think that third wave feminism tries to grapple with is the distinction between sex and gender. And saying that being physically a woman isn't the same as identifying as a woman. And we're going to talk about that in a second too. So is there any questions on the history of feminism really quickly that we've just gone through about a century of history? Good job, everyone. So this is the sex versus gender distinction. And these terms, these definitions come from the WHO, the World Health Organization. So definitions talking about what identity categories you fit into, not always perfect. These ones seemed good for the lecture. So they're from the WHO, keep that in mind when you read them. So the first one is that sex refers to the biological and physiological characteristics that define men and women. I have videos that I want to link to my lectures, and I'm having trouble getting them. There's a really good YouTube video if you Google this that has posters and shows. So biological and physiological characteristics. Sex is often something that you're born with. A common misconception about sex is that there are just two of them. You can be born as an intersex individual. It still means that you have a sex, but the sex doesn't fit into one of those binary categories. And intersex is commonly the term that's used currently to refer to that. If you hear hermaphrodite was used to refer to this and not transgender, or is that different?
I think hermaphrodite was
Transgender? Okay.
Hermaphrodite's like
both.
yeah, it's like intersex.
Yeah. So there's kind of been a shift from using that term to using the term intersex, just FYI, but people still use it differently. The term middle sex, which is a novel which I really recommend reading because it's very interesting, uses the character identifies as hermaphrodite. So that's sex. Gender refers to something a little bit different. Gender isn't something that you're born intrinsically with, it's something that you identify with. Whereas sex is often something that you were born intrinsically with, something that your body dictates. So gender refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attitudes that a given society considers appropriate for men and women. And again, men and women, two categories. They aren't the only categories, but so that's what gender is. Gender is more of something that you perform. to use a term from an author I like. It's something that can change at different points in time, depending on how you feel. There are a lot of people now, I forgot what the term is called, but who identify for like certain amounts of months at a time as a woman, and then will change to identifying as male, do things like makeup artists, facial hair. So male and female are sex categories, while masculine and feminine are gender categories. And this is something that I have found helpful as a distinction when I read debate arguments about feminism, is if you talk about masculine and feminine things, and people try to link you to second-wave feminism and say you're being based in biology, that's not what sex is, this is sexist, you're discriminating against men. Talking about things as masculine and feminine, even though they have those roots, the linguistic roots in the terms, is helpful because it describes gender categories, not necessarily sex categories. Another big issue in women's and gender studies and in women's rights movements, feminism, and gender studies is essentialism versus constructivism. So these are kind of two ideas of how we become an identity. Essentialism would say that the practice regarding, and this again, very vague definition, the practice of regarding something as a presupposed human trait as having an innate existence or universal validity, rather than as being social, ideological, or intellectual construct. So essentialism would say that because your body is a certain way, it dictates what you will become. And then it can be applied, that's more specific to sex. It can also be applied in different ways to different concepts. For instance, even if gender is something that you identify with and not something that's intrinsic, if you identify as the male gender, then there's something intrinsic about that that bonds all of you together. It's something that you can look at any male and say, you are a male, you are masculine. There's something universal, and there's something innate about you. It's essential to your being. Constructivism is harder to define because it's kind of the opposite of essentialism, but says that identity categories are social, ideological, and intellectual constructs. Identity is socially constructed. When I'm born, I don't necessarily have this idea. There's something intrinsic about what I will become. How I've learned to become a woman, how I've learned to dress, to wear my hair, to wear makeup, to not wear shoes, I guess since I'm not wearing them now. But that's not based on the fact that I have a certain biology or that I've been told I was a certain identity category. It's based on the fact, or no, it is based on the fact that I've been told that there is a certain identity category. That's how I should act as a woman. So constructivism says that essentialism is incorrect, but that it's also alienating to a lot of individuals when you say that there's something innate about your sex or your gender. Because then people that are very intersectional, if you identify with parts of being a woman, but other parts you don't identify with, this can be assuming that when one woman speaks, you speak for all women. Problem with second-wave feminism, constructivists think that understanding identity categories and constructed will help solve for that. Okay. So, does anyone have any questions about what feminism and gender issues are? Questions about what we've talked about before we go into a couple of different FemKs that you can read in debate rounds. So the first one is FMIR, which stands for Feminist International Relations. These are just a couple authors, we'll talk about that in a sec. But Feminist International Relations says that the way in which we engage in international politics is rooted in masculinity and patriarchy, and that we need to be able to change the way in which we relate to other countries in order to make society a better place. One of the really famous authors from Feminist International Relations is Jan Tickner. Someone that I really like, and I don't know if technically you would classify him as a FemIR theorist, but that's where I always read him, is Cuomo. I know that there's also a politician from New York named Cuomo, not the same one. But he talks about positive peace and what positive peace means. And so a lot of times peace is described as the absence of war. If your country is not currently engaged in a conflict, you are at peace. And what that doesn't take into account is that there's a lot of structural violence that's happening in those societies. For instance, in our society, I don't think we're technically, I can never remember, because we are at war. Anyways, I don't think we're technically at war in our country. There we go. Even though we have, the war on everyone. But there are still issues like what's happening with reproductive rights in Texas. Issues like that is that peace. Can we define that as a stable country? Cuomo would say no. He would say that positive peace, we need to have peace as a different type of understanding of what relations mean and what having a country be stable means. And it's not just not being at war. It's making sure that instead of just the nation state being secure at a very big level, the individuals are secure as well. And this is also a distinction that I like to make in IR debates, especially FemIR. or read like actually this is applicable, or securitization, is that securitization of the nation state is a lot different than securitization of the individual. And securitization is probably the wrong term, but that at the level of the nation state, securing everything, one of the problems with it is exactly what Como says, is that it overlooks some things. But focusing on individual security means we can still look at consequences. It means we can still look at how people are living their life, not just whether or not they're dehumanized. But doing it on an individual level forces us to look at a lot of things that the current political lens just doesn't allow us to understand. So, individual security versus the nation-state security. Interesting concept in debate. Most people don't know how to, most people haven't, and partly this hasn't really, one of those things that hasn't trickled down yet. There's another author, and it starts with a B, and it's not Bleicher, and I forget who it is. Again, I'll look, I haven't been able to have internet to post my PowerPoints, but when I do, I'll put some of the authors in here. The next category of feminism is ecofeminism. Ecofeminism is a very interesting critique and debate because it lets you get access to a lot of different impacts. But it also links into almost every turn against feminism that people will read against you. So it's kind of a balancing act between those two things. So what ecofeminism is it creates a link between women and ecology. And again, French people, François Deabon in La Feminisme ou la Mode. I used to take French, I don't anymore. I'm not very good at it. Anyways, in this book is where the term ecofeminism was originally coined. I'm not sure where it originated from before that, if she stole the term, but I know that that's where it was coined. So ecofeminism connects the exploitation and domination of women with that of the environment, and argues that there's a connection between women and nature that comes from their shared history of oppression by a patriarchal Western society. So, again, can anyone see why this definition might be problematic? Not you. Anyone else? Yes?
Kind of just, I'm trying to think of a way to put it more, just thinking of women solely within feminism, because my understanding is like, third wave feminism isn't so much about women as it is about equality and accepting.
Yes, that is one of the problems with ecofeminism. And that's a very good answer. The answer that I was kind of fishing for, which I guess is a terrible way to ask questions, is it's very essentializing. It assumes that there's a fundamental connection between women and the environment and women and nature, which in a lot of ways can be used negatively, that our job is to make babies and nurture things. But in a lot of ways, it really does accurately describe the exploitation of nature and the exploitation of women. So I'm kind of conflicted as to how I feel about ecofeminism. But the way that, so ecofeminism says that there's the logic of patriarchy, and the way that I like to think of ecofeminism within the debates is that there's a logic of patriarchy, and the logic of patriarchy leads, and it's like a cascading tree branches, leads to two tiers, and the first one is ecological degradation, and you can internally link patriarchy to environmental collapse, and there are a lot of really good warrants and arguments as to why you can do that, and then it also leads to the more traditional type of patriarchy that we think of, so makes war inevitable because of aggression mindset, makes things like sexual assault inevitable because we believe that bodies are something that can be owned, causes devaluation of life, whereas I prefer to call it spirit murder, of populations, which is bad. So that's one of the reasons I like the Ecofemk. The bad reason is because, yes, it is specifically talking about women, and also specifically talking about what a woman is. We didn't do a definition of feminism. We'll do that at the end. But yes, ecofeminism. It's interesting. Anyone have any questions about ecofem?
I have a comment about
Yeah, go for it.
So,
Yeah, any comments, feel free to jump in as well.
the way that I always felt the need to frame ecofeminism debates, because I have a problem with this essentialization as well, is it is not about women as it is in the traditional lit base. It is about feminized bodies, which means that you also get access to critical race implications. I also think that it is far less essentializing, and it's far more accurate to explain how patriarchy manifests to feminize the other, and sometimes that is women's bodies seeking mass amounts of pollutants that make them have horrific birth defects and reproductive issues. But other times it is enacting war against the other because they have been feminized because they are like poor or persons of color or whatever reason that subtracts them from the dominant power narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, while this definition is a really good introduction, thinking of it more comprehensively about the process of feminization, which happens to the environment, to women, and to other bodies, is a better way of framing it in the debate that is more offensive.
I like that. Yeah, do you?
I was also going to say that I think the environment is a really stable place where we can see the physical effects of patriarchy, whereas gender is still something that's kind of conceptual and happens in a psychological and like interpersonal relationship, whereas the actual destruction of those entities being controlled by consumptive aggressive powers is very visible in the environment, and we can use that as a parallel to kind of talk about those greater issues.
I like that too.
And if anybody wants to know where they got all those crazy arguments, the authors are Vandana Shiva.
Shiva, that's what I was going for. Okay.
Vandana Shiva.
Thank you.
That's not a V.
It's a V. It's an S.
Oh.
I said.
Yeah.
I was trying to figure out who the S from is.
The book that I would recommend for beginners entering Vandana Shiva is Staying Alive. You can actually find the PDF online and it's free. The other book that ties really well into this, and she'll probably get into this later, is Criticism of Militarism or Militarization. Kind of ties well into FemIR, is going to be In Kashmir. It's a book about the Kashmir crisis, if you will, between Pakistan and India. But it describes these notions, right? Kashmir, K.
I know this is just the fact that my computer's being slow.
Oh, okay.
Also, I can't type, but we'll just stop this.
So yeah, in Kashmir's going to go into this, and then understand that all of these movements, right, like that's 1974, so that's going to fit into the time period of when people were still in the second wave. A lot of these movements will naturally progress and get more sophisticated, and one of the most common ways of doing that is if you switch the word sex with gender, right? So if you switch the word woman with feminist or with like feminine ideology, then it becomes more broad. So just understand that a lot of these things happen naturally, that a lot of these movements were critiqued internally, and so they've naturally evolved from these processes.
Another book that I really enjoyed reading was Mary Daly's Gynecology, and it kind of walks through the process of feminizing the environment. She uses really cool, radical, like hippie language, and so it's like a really fun book to read. But it's gyn-ecology. Like, it's like a play on words. Gyn-ecology.
G-Y-N ecology.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's really cool.
I see what you did there.
That's great.
Mary Daly is like awesome. D-A-L-Y.
Can't spell anything. I literally can't spell the word anything. Okay. Any other authors for you? This is great. Yeah, and I find for that a lot of critiques, if you, like I said, if you replace man and woman with masculine and feminine or these other ways of doing it, it can make them become it can evade a lot of the common critiques of within the feminist movement that you will hear. Islamic feminism. There's a book called The Heart of Islam, I believe. I don't know who wrote it. It's in my car because I read it from my classes, but I really liked it. It talks about individual. So Islamic feminism is one of these ways that applies feminism to non-Western women. So, right, the typical iconic feminist looks a lot like me. She is a wealthy white woman who talks about her struggles as a wealthy white woman and thinks that there are essential traits about being that white person that apply to every woman in the world. So Islamic feminism is a specific attempt to overcome that in Islam. And so it talks about, so there's a lot of critique in the media, right, that you can't wear a veil and be a feminist, that you can't be Islamic and be a feminist. And so there's a movement within the religion that talks about how you can do this. One of the things that the book, The Heart of Islam, talks about is individual versus communitarian values. And I found this really helpful to explain some of the politics in those countries. Is that in the United States, right, the values of the individual are always what we put as a priority. They always come first. So, for instance, an individual's right to get a job, that's an essential human right, the right to work, that shouldn't be confounded, blocked, obscured in any way. In other places, the idea that there is a the family unit instead of the individual is the most important part. Would lead to communitarian values such as women won't work because they need to raise children, need to do things within the home within a society that they need, that there's a different role besides individuality that benefiting the society that will happen. And again, this is not universal to all Islamic feminists, but it's something. It's a way of re-understanding values, because we often assume in America, because we have just such an individualistic focus, that everyone agrees with that. It's not. Sometimes the community is valued higher than the individual, which will lead to different politics, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong or sexist. It just means that they're different, and we have to understand how individual agency can be achieved within those politics. So that's Islamic feminism. Tracy, did you want to talk about this anymore? That's the sign for Islamic feminism.
Which is pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So, I also have some books on this as well. Leila Ahmed wrote this book called Unveiling the Revolution about 2 years ago. And Leila Ahmed grew up in Egypt during the 1970s during the Unveiling movement. And when she moved to the United States in the early 1990s and women were starting to veil again as part of this like political process, it was like very shocking and disorienting for her. And so she wrote this book in response to it, as women that were using the veil as an opportunity to engage in the process of liberation, which I think it's super applicable to debate rounds, because you get into these, people make comments about veils a lot that I think that it's really good to have stuff about, but generally it's just also a good book. Carolyn Moxley Ruse is an anthropologist that wrote about Islamic feminism, Black Islamic feminism in the United States. I don't remember the name of her book.
What's her name again?
Carolyn Moxley Ruse.
Is that his spelled Ruse?
Rouse. Yeah. And Samba Mahmood has written a lot about women using traditional patriarchal structures as a means of reclaiming. The examples that she uses are veiling, but she also talks about some practices in India with, which is not related to Islam, but she does talk about some stuff that happened in India with infanticide and the question of that as well. I think Islamic Fem is a really well-rounded approach to feminism, is just my general opinion, and I think it's a really good introductory way to expose yourself to women of color femme, which I think is probably the most applicable in debate, because people do carry a lot of very traditional second wave perspectives of feminism into round, and so approaching feminism from a different perspective is very strategic, because it means that you can garner all of their impacts, but then still have like this unique net benefit to your methodology or ideology, to explain that in debate speak. It's also just a very, very interesting area.
And I don't have a slide for this, but there's also some really interesting literature on Black feminism in the United States. Specifically this book, The Dark Side of the Street. It's a book I can't know how to, Anyways, for The Dark Side of the Street, that talks about women during the Civil Rights Movement in the South. And so it talks about two things. And the first thing that it talks about is the way, and this is kind of why, this is one of the reasons, this is the first time, okay, whatever. Talks about two things. The first thing is the way in which women in the Civil Rights Movement had a lot of the ideas and were a lot of the community leaders and were never the public figures. And it kind of is a historical process that unveils the work that women did for that movement, which I think is really important to realize that. And the second part is it talks about, it shares narratives of women that were living in the South during that time period of sexual assault and the ways that they were treated in society and what happened to them. And it talks about them sharing their narratives and their stories. And so it does that for like a third of the book. And then it talks about why sharing narratives is so important. And it's really contextualized to specifically what happened during the Civil Rights Movement. I really like that book. So, any questions about Islamic feminism, Black feminism, anarcho-feminism? There's nothing on the slide. I ran out of time. I apologize. Anarcho-feminism is what you would assume. It's anarchy, but for women. Anarcho-feminism, Emma Goldman from the 1960s is the main author for this. When I was first reading the K, she was like my idol. But anarcho-feminism talks about ways that can exist in society and ways that the state exists uniquely to oppress women. And again, this is the 60s. These are a lot of concepts that are very centralizing. changing out terms, talking about them in different ways, can do that. But if you're interested, and anarchy has become less and less good of a critique argument now that more and more people have answers to just generic state bad as critiques, because they think that's what all critiques are. But I think that if you put the time and effort and research into it, it's a very interesting and good critique. But that's why it doesn't have its own slide, it's because it's not alt-read. But Anarcha-Fem, Emma Goldman, is interesting. There's also, and I've been looking for this article for so long and haven't been able to find it, but there's an article that's more recent about anarcho-feminism that talks about how women are treated within activist spaces that I find really interesting, and even though I can't remember the name, the warrant of the article I think is really interesting, and we'll transition as well into a discussion of women in debate, which we'll do for the second half of the lecture. But it talks about how in activist circles, when instances of sexism, and this is specific to women, but I know a lot of other authors also talked about this in other ways with different identity categories, but when sexism or abuse happens to women within the activist circles, and they speak up about it, the response of the circle is to rehabilitate the instigator of the violence, and that woman continuing to exist within the activist circle is very negative to that. If they continue to speak about it, they're very much shunned from the circle, or the activist group, because they're distracting from a better cause, which is, this is for specifically the anarchist groups. I've also read it with environmental groups, that they're saving the environment, they're stopping the deconstruction of a forest, and so if a couple of people have to leave the group because they don't feel welcome there, that's less important than saving the forest, which I think is a really interesting, warranted argument to consider in alternative debates, and critique debates in general. But, we do have a couple more slides. Postmodern feminism. So, the Penguin Dictionary, funny thing, doesn't actually have a definition of postmodern feminism. They have a definition of postmodern. So, postmodern, which is what this definition is a general and sometimes controversial term used to refer to changes, developments, and tendencies which have taken place and are taking place in literature, art, music, architecture, philosophy, etc. since the 1940s or 1950s. So, it's a general change in developments and tendencies that has occurred. Can you get more specific? It is oftentimes hard to categorize and talk about postmodern feminists or postmodernists because they focus a lot on deconstruction, and the lack of categories, which is why it's so hard to categorize them, makes it difficult to teach, but they're their own identity. Yes?
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, but when I read about postmodern feminism as its own individualistic movement, one of the key things to remember is that postmodernism happened because there was this idea that like humanity was too good, that we would never do things of like atrocious value to one another. So some scholars, and this is not all scholars, but some scholars indicate that the postmodern era for feminism started after Nazi internment camps. And that was one of the big signifiers to the world that society was not like inherently good and we could actually commit mass atrocities on one another. Again, that is some scholars' interpretation, not all scholars' interpretation, but it's always good to understand like that the history of it is that there is a drastic shift in the ideology of humanity.
Yes. One of the ways that I like to read one of the authors that I would put into this category is Judith Butler. I really like her. So I don't know if any of you have been to my K lectures and heard me rant and rave about Foucault. Maybe not, maybe. But so Foucault has this book called The History of Sexuality. And The History of Sexuality is a wonderful, wonderful book that everyone should read, which talks about how sexuality has come to it. It talks about the history of sexuality. It's a very self-explanatory title. But it never talks about gender. And so I started reading Judith Butler when I was trying to figure out how gender related to that genealogy of how sexuality is constructed by power norms and dynamics. And then got into her, and so it could kind of be seen as a forward-moving transition from that area. And then she also has a lot of really other interesting things. She's the one who talks about gender as a performance, that gender is something that's a disguise, it's a costume that we take on and off every day when we wake up, which is a concept that I really like. Other postmodern feminists? I mean, in some ways, like Deleuze can be applied to post-colonial feminism, which is also something we didn't talk about. Spivak in Can the Subaltern Speak? Not necessarily a feminist text, but post-colonial feminism, looking at how colonialism, creating feminist movements within post-colonial spaces, is what that would be. I can't think of a more specific definition that would be universal, but Deleuze, who talks about the structure of language and literature as a mechanism for power. Foucault's whole thing is genealogy. If you would agree that Foucault's whole thing is genealogy, then Deleuze's would be etymology, I think. Yes, etymology. He's used a lot for post-colonial feminism, but again, doesn't specifically ever talk about this. In Coldness and Cruelty, there's talk about sex, which is why we read it with the History of Sexuality, but he can be applied. His concept can be applied to a lot of post-colonial feminism. The other thing to realize about post-colonial feminism, and we didn't, I don't know if this is, the development of movements of feminism, especially like African feminism, happen in unique ways and respond to unique issues. That putting, and we talked about this earlier, putting a general scheme of this is how the movement of feminism needs to move through history, or needs to go forward, doesn't address a lot of those very specific issues. And I think a lot of times, if you're having trouble understanding or reading things like post-colonial feminism or Islamic feminism or African feminism, it's really helpful to read some authors that talk about specific examples. For instance, there's, I think this is a book, I think it's called like Globalized Hip Hop, but I'm not sure. East African hip hop is the name of the book. And it talks about hip hop movements. And it has a couple different chapters that are just devoted to talking about women within hip hop movements and the way that they're reclaiming language in the hip hop space and the way that they're reclaiming, it actually reminds me a lot of debate, performance and debate, but the way that they perform on stage and use language and act and write their songs and just situate themselves physically on the stage to take back that space. That's become an activist space in especially East Africa. It's become an activist space for young people with political ideologies who are expressing that in a way that they can't do in the political system because they are young and have different political ideas, and reclaiming that space to make it safe for women. Yes?
Yeah, so some people propose colonialism that I think you're really good at understanding this, that I've read, so I would suggest Edward Said's Orientalism.
Oh, yes. Yes, post-colonialist. Yes.
Yeah, that's post-colonialist. Audre Lorde has some good work that she does. And then I've been recommended Mohanty. I've never read it myself.
I haven't read that one either.
And so,
Andrew Smith's kind of post-colonialist too.
huh?
I think Andrew Smith is also post-colonialist.
Yeah, Andrew Smith is a good one. If you're looking more into like Chicana feminisms, you have obviously Gloria Anzaldúa, Cherie Moraga, who else would be good enough? If you're looking into some things like, I know a lot of men who get into feminism very early, they're like, they often misconstrue the argument for direct attack. And I think one author that is controversial but at the same time does a good job to bridge that for a lot of people who identify as men or masculine is Jackson Katz. He has a book, it's called The Macho Paradox. It's pretty good if you're looking into that from that perspective. Purvis, if you're looking at queer theory, Purvis is a good author. Obviously Butler works really good with that as well. Do you have anything else? Anybody else?
I have some stuff, answers to anarcho that was just.
We can post like a reading list.
Yeah.
We can come up with, I think with the combination of all of our brains, we can come up with a pretty good one.
Yeah, we should do that.
Yes. So, there was one more thing I want to talk about, and then I forgot what it was. The last thing I want to talk about is going to transition us into if you would all still like to talk about women in debate. Okay. We're going to transition us into that, and we have like 20 minutes, which is a very complex issue. But so the last kind of philosophical concept I want to talk about was strategic essentialism. And so a lot of people, we have this world where, your sex doesn't dictate your gender, and your gender is defined by yourself, and your sex isn't in binary categories. So there's a lot of classifying people within certain groups can be very harmful in a lot of instances. But there are also a lot of instances where we need to do it. For instance, and I think a really good example of this is talking about women in debate. Yes, the concept of talking about a woman and defining what a woman in debate is and looks like and acts like is problematic, but it calls attention to a problem. And it happens a lot in political movements that there's a, I forget what it's called. whatever. It calls attention to those things, and it allows a space for political advocacy and for political action. And I think that the part that you have to realize is that strategic essentialism is a term used by Spivak. Yeah. Spivak, who writes Can the Subaltern Speak? I don't know if this is the book where she writes about it in, but talks about strategic essentialism. That's the author that this comes from. That talking about those identity categories is helpful in a lot of instances because it gives a voice to people whose voices aren't usually heard. So for the last 20 minutes, it will kind of be more of a discussion, I guess, about problems that we see with women in debate. I will say that there's, if people have been reading net benefits, which I often don't, but did for some reason this summer, a thread was started like a couple days ago, actually, maybe like a week ago, about the lack of female-female teams in NPDA, which is the National Parliamentary Debate Association tournament. They have Conrad Hack and a couple of his students did like a analytical study of this, and there's never been a female-female team in finals of this tournament, and a female-female team has never won. And if you look back the years that female-female teams have gotten to certain rounds, it's like 5-8 times throughout the history of this. And so I was reading this thread, and I think this is an amazing project, and I really appreciate the people that commented on this. And this is not a diss against them. But so I found this thread, and I don't go on net benefits all the time, and so it wasn't the first day it was posted. And there were like 10 or 15 so comments. And so one of the comments that really bothered me, and so all of the comments were people who identified as men, were men, not being able to comprehend why there weren't more women in debate. And one of the comments that someone made said something like, it's just because women don't enjoy competitive argumentation. They find this speech violent and they don't like it. It's like, no, you as a judge thinking this is why female-female teams don't do better in debate, because every time that we try to engage in your discourse, we get isolated from your debate sphere. For the last 3 years, I debated with another woman. That's my background in debate. That is why. That is why we're having trouble in this activity. Not because we intrinsically, essentially don't like argument. That is not true. It's because the way that you perceive it. And so there are a couple issues that I think are really important that the community needs to address for women in debate, which we can't talk about. But is there anything, I don't know, people who thought that this was a community forum type lecture, is there anything that you want to talk about specifically? Okay. And so I don't know if anyone here else was at dinner last night, and Ryan. We talked about this at dinner a little bit last night. And I haven't really talked about it with a lot of people in the debate communities. I don't know how it's going to go over. But the way that we do constraints in debate. So for people who don't know, when you go to a tournament, you have a lot of tournaments have MPJ, which is mutual preference judging. And so you have a sheet. And the sheet has 25 judges. And you can pref 7 of them as A prefs, which is your top pref. And you can pref 13 of them as B prefs, which is the middle pref. And you can prep the rest of them as C prefs, which is your lowest pref. And then you can constrain like 3 people. But then there are also coaches that you can strike and say, I don't want this person to judge me, maybe like 3 people in a pool of 20, maybe probably less. But then there's also something called constraints. So like people that have so it's people that aren't unbiased in judging you and have a personal relationship with you. So for instance, a lot of my coaches from this past 3 years are going to different schools. They can't judge me in a debate tournament. Obviously, that makes sense. They are a little bit biased. They've seen every one of my practice rounds. They know all my files. They'll be very mad at me if I mess up. Things like that. They could be biased and just really want Oregon to win. That would be an instance of a constraint. And they go back a certain number of years, depending on who coached you. I'm not entirely sure how that works. But another thing that you constrain people for is people that you've slept with. Because there is a lot of relationships that happen in the debate community. Maybe not a lot. I also think that my unique history in debate has made me think that there are a lot more than there are. No, I don't mean that in an odd way, but the way that the different communities that I've been a part of, I think that as debate as a whole, it might not be as prevalent, but the specific communities that I've been in, it has been more of an issue. And so there are 2 things about constraints. The first one is that your coaches who see your constraints and your pref sheets, the same way that they wouldn't go up to a judge and say, oh, hey, so-and-so deprefed you. They really don't want you to judge them because they think that you're dumb. The same way that they wouldn't do that, coaches shouldn't be going around and telling the people on your team or people in the community who you constrain or who you slept with. And I found that, and I don't know who's in charge of this in TAB, I don't know who sees this in TAB, but I found that a lot of people know these things because someone in TAB told them. And I think that that's a really big problem. Not just a problem for women in debate. I think that in debate it uniquely affects women because there are so few of us. compared to the very large amount of men, and because we're perceived differently. But I think that really has to stop. That one, not as controversial. Probably it should stop. The second one is how we constrain people. Debate is a social community. We hang out, we talk, we drink, if we're 21. And so we build friendships with a lot of the people that judge and coach us. Some people will say and do things that will make, for instance, me very uncomfortable. And I talked about this in the forum. When I walk into a debate round, the first thing I'm thinking about is how they're perceiving me, my body, my sexuality. People who have said very derogatory things to me about women or women in debate. And I am conflicted because on one hand, I really want to constrain those people because I don't think that I should be forced to debate in front of someone who makes me feel that uncomfortable. On the other hand, I know that creating a precedent for X person said something mean to me, I'm going to constrain them, will lead to a lot of teams to just constrain people they don't like. So that's an issue I wanted to bring up because I think we need to dialogue about it. The other issue for women in debate, I think, is role models. There aren't a lot of them. There's a very unique way that you have to act and present yourself as a woman in debate, and it's hard to learn that when you don't have anyone to talk to. It's also hard to deal with some of the issues that come up in the debate community if you don't have anyone to talk to. For instance, a lot of things that would have really impeded Katie and I's ability to compete the last 3 years, I would not have. I love my male coaches. I love Ben Dodds and Tom Shalley and Mac Ander. They're wonderful, amazing people. I would not have felt comfortable telling them some of these things. And so I went to Sarah, and I told Sarah, and Sarah fixed it for me. And she said, go, debate, do your thing. I'm going to deal with it. And I think that having women at tournaments is really powerful for that. I just learned that we have a sexual harassment representative at NPDA. I just learned this. No one talks about it. Their only goal is to be mad at project teams. It's the only reason they exist, and they don't tell you that they exist because they don't want anyone with legitimate sexual harassment complaints to come to them. So I just learned this. I think that's a great idea if we utilize it correctly. But I think that not only hiring more women as coaches and judges, but seeing what roles you give them. So if you hire a female coach, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're creating a role model in the community. Are you bringing them to tournaments? Are they judging? How are other teams prepping them? Are you giving them administrative tasks? Are you giving them coaching tasks? Are they only supposed to talk to their students when they lecture? And I had said that I wanted to give this lecture at the BDC. But when you give them lectures, are they only teaching about feminist issues so people assume they don't know about anything else? Issues like this that come up with coaches and judges that I think we should resolve to have more role models in the community. So that's my 2 cents for 5 minutes. Questions, comments, concerns, things you want to share?
Yeah, I think the community has like a big problem with the way in which we see female debaters. So for those of you who don't know, we did the project, and at Nationals, there was a team, still undisclosed to me as to who this team was, but essentially they went to TAB, and they were making the argument that because Alyssa had written statements about her white privilege on her body with a Sharpie, that was pre-prep material, and that her body was material, and it should be viewed as artwork before the round, right? And like the director of NPTE, because some dumbass went to him and said this, because of his job, now he has to come tell us, right? We're not even being formally indicted, and I love Joe Blasdale for coming and making us aware of the situation beforehand, because he felt something might happen. But just the fact that, like, if you want to know where state of high-level competition is, that's where it is. When you do something crazy, nobody cares how good it is or what you're doing for the community. They will find the cheapest way to get you out of there. And they will belittle you beyond humanness, and they will treat you like a nobody, and they don't even care about your personal experiences. Like, I think that's one thing we don't talk about. I think the way in which we compete and the levels of which we go to compete, we don't talk about. And there's been other instances of other women who have had to deal with the same board at a national tournament for the stupidest reasons, because at that tournament everybody wants to win. But where we take it and what precedents we set, I think are very problematic. I think it's very problematic that like a team can do that and go to that committee and like stir that up, but we don't get to know who that is. Right? The community does not get to know what coach, what team thinks in this mentality, right? And I mean, personally, like, you watch policy rounds, and the way in which they call each other out is very different because of the way in which they do constraints. right? Like, a lot of the things in parliamentary debate aren't always necessarily apparent to everybody. And so, I mean, I think it's important to share those kinds of experiences. Because, I mean, if you're looking at a project and you think it's cool and you should do it, I'm the first one to encourage you. But I'll also be the first one to say, be prepared to get rocked. And I'm not saying maybe on the floor in a debate, but emotionally rocked. You will be emotionally unstable the entire time. You are vulnerable, you are letting people take shots at you now. And so, you know, I mean, that was something that I came to, like, that was just trippy to me.
Yeah.
Like, somebody literally came and said we should label my partner as material.
Definitely think, like, so when it comes to, like, sex and gender, you know, like, identification is kind of twofold. There's the way that you identify, and then there's the way that society identifies for you. You know, like, when people see a certain, like, physical characteristic, they determine it as being allocated to a particular sex and therefore gender. And so it's really interesting because I don't think we should treat people differently, but the body provides a context for our relationships. And so, like what Brandon says, we have to be very conscious of, like, how we construe certain things. Like, when people say that Brandon and Alyssa shouldn't debate because Alyssa's body is pre-prepped material, or when Kendra is told in her IE rounds that her breasts are a prop, like, that's problematic. And I think especially about the way that we talk about women in debate, because I know Alyssa and Cecily had done some research and they saw that when we start out, like, when people come into this community, women and men are typically even. The problem is, is that more women drop out. Like, by the end of the careers, there are more, men than there are women. Like, there is something that is structurally excluding women and pushing them out of this community that happens. And I think a few ways that I see it really happen is the way that, while some men, like, some male-bodied individuals can be, construed as being, like, confident and aggressive with their arguments. For women, it's construed as being bitches. And a lot of times, like, I know you had spoken of this, Megan, yesterday, and I've heard it so many fucking times, and it pisses me off about, when women spread, their voices get really high, and that annoys me. And it's just like, okay, have you ever heard Nick Larmer spread? Because that is the highest pitch shit ever. High pitch is not unique to, like, women spreading. That is just what happens when you are speaking that quickly. You go into new frequencies. But it is demonized when it comes from a woman's voice, and it is glorified when it comes from a man's. Like, and being told that, like, I don't like the sound of your voice. You know, like, when we look at, like, I just can't help but be aware of, like, the statistics that happen when award ceremonies are happening. And a lot of speaker awards go to men because we like the sound of men's voices better. And I don't want to hear you yell at me for 8 minutes, lady, like, kind of a thing. And, like, we really have to be conscious. Another thing that I think we really need to be conscious about is, like, our tendencies to, like, slut shame and, like, have this, like, construction of, like, oh, since women are in this space, they have to be more aware of, like, their body as a context, so, like, they need to make sure and cover up their tits because their tits are distracting, and like, oh, you're showing too much leg, and, like, but then also people are being, like, kind of constructed to, you should be dressing up, you should be looking professional, because you can't just wear, like, jeans and a t-shirt the way that most men get away with either. And so I just invite everyone to be very conscious of the way that they kind of talk about performances in debate, because I know that, like, a lot, like, I grew up in the South. I grew up in, like, a Southern policy team where, you know, our coach told us, like, women teams just don't do as well, so I don't advise them. Like, we have to be really aware of how we construct different styles and what we tell people. Like, if you're ever judging around, like, I would really hesitate to ever tell a girl to, like, tone it down, or, like, don't be so mean. It just isn't attractive and fun to watch. And it's like, you know, the body provides a context that we do have to be very careful about how we construct certain actions based on, like, the gender that delivers those performances.
Yeah, I hope that we can talk about, I'm going to stop the lecture so we can have a break before the round start. I hope we can continue talking about this later. It's something that people a lot of times don't want to talk about outside of actual like spaces where you're supposed to talk about it. I will just say, because we always have at the end of the forums, a couple of things that you can do to make your team and your community more inclusive to female debaters. First, consider the music you're listening to in the van rides. I personally really like listening to Super Chick, which is a Christian rock band. I'm not Christian, but they don't do things like, they don't use derogatory names, they don't do things like, oh, I fucked that bitch last night. But it's also really like exciting, pumped up music that I like to listen to for debates. If you're playing porn in your debate band, stop. We won't call out names here, but don't.
Sex positive feminism. My body yelling context is different.
At tournaments, and this is something that a lot of people have gotten mad at before, I like to have girls' night. Paige and I went out of the women tournament and got drinks and hung out at the bar. We're both 21 and just sat around and talked without just the girls in debate chilling. I think that we should do that more. I think a lot of times women aren't as nice to each other in debate. I'm guilty of it. I think we should do that. I think when you're hiring judges, especially to come to tournaments, be conscious of who you're hiring and why you're hiring them. If it's a perceived skill difference that you assume because everyone talks about male judges a lot more, or if it's an actual skill difference. So consider if you're hiring a lot of men to be your judges and coaches at tournaments, even if they're not on staff. There are tons of other little things that you can do. Be considerate, be nice. Don't be afraid to talk about these issues with your female debaters if you're a male coach or a male member of the community. Most of the time it's just because we don't feel like we can talk about it to people who wouldn't understand. But if you're open about it, it's one of the most helpful things you can do. Don't slut shame.
Actively recruit women to join.
Actively recruit women.